Hello and welcome to the history of quests in Hearthstone. I hope you enjoy the video. Many of you may expect that our journey through the history of quests would begin in 2017 with Journey to Un'Goro. However, I believe that the first experimentation around the idea of a game-long quest came 2 expansions earlier in Whispers of the Old Gods, through the legendary minion Cthulhu. For those of you that weren't playing at the time, Cthulhu was a legendary minion with a battle cry that dealt damage equal to its attack, randomly split among all enemies. Over the course of the game, you could play minions which would buff the stats of Cthulhu in your deck, enabling a massive endgame payoff. Although this is not exactly the same as the quest cards which we've come to know and love, this was Hearthstone's first exploration into the space of playing cards with delayed effects that set up for some payoff later in the game. This mechanic proved popular among most players, with Cthulhu being given away for free at the beginning of Whispers of the Old Gods, and setting up an archetype in Cthulhu Druid which was a fan favourite throughout the expansion. Without spoiling the rest of the video too much, I can say that this is a pattern of usage which we would see mirrored by many quest cards later in the game's life. The following expansion, Mean Streets of Gadgetzan, saw a similar delayed payoff mechanic in the form of Jade cards. These cards for Druid, Shaman and Rogue were usually understated for the cost, but had the additional effect of summoning a Jade Golem with stats equal to the number of Jade cards that you had played so far this game. However, unlike Cthulhu, a Jade Golem was summoned every time that a Jade card was played, meaning that the cards had both an initially small immediate payoff and a bigger, more delayed payoff. These Jade Golems would become bigger and bigger throughout the game and proved to be much more divisive amongst fans for this reason. Ultimately, this would spawn the infamous Day 9 meme, Summon a Larger and Larger Man, which will be linked in the video description. Again, this may not look like the types of quests that we are used to in the modern game, however I think that the experimentation that took place with both Cthulhu and Jade Golems ultimately laid the groundwork for quests as we know them today. This brings us to Un'Goro, where our journey can begin in earnest. Quest cards were announced, and they seemed to rest somewhere between the 2 mechanics previously mentioned. As you made progress towards the quest objective, you would get nothing for each individual item of progress, with Blizzard seemingly learning from the mistakes made with Jade Golems by ensuring that there would be no payoff until the quest had been fully completed. Unlike Cthulhu, however, the payoffs for these quests were not designed to be a single game-winning play. Instead, they would usually be completed towards the end of the mid-game, usually signalling a significant rise in power level for the deck in question, but not a certain victory. There were some exceptions to this general rule, however for the most part this seemed to be the design intent behind the first wave of quests. The thematic aspect of this first wave of quests was spot on, with Megafin making you feel like a Murloc warlord, Karnassa leaving you feeling as though you were sicking raptors upon your opponent, and Galvadon even spawning a song of his own from Team Kibler at the time, again linked in the description. To me, Fireplume's heart best fulfilled the fantasy and gameplay of a quest card. It created a deck in Taunt Warrior which felt good to play and relatively fair to play against. The objective of playing 7 Taunt minions required some unique deck building to fulfill, but not so much so that the deck would be useless if you did not manage to quickly fulfill the quest requirements. The reward of Sulfurous gave you some immediate power with a 4/2 weapon and replaced your hero power with deal 8 damage to a random enemy. This would certainly be a significant power swing in any matchup, however it would not be instantly game winning. This would give the player some time to use the newly acquired hero power from the quest reward to its fullest and enable gameplay patterns within the game to shift around the newly acquired quest reward. The Marsh Queen was an example of a quest which nailed the thematic elements to me, but left something to be desired from a power perspective. The card encouraged an aggro early game playstyle, with Queen Karnassa ideally being played on turn 5 or 6 to end out the game on turn 9 or 10. Any later than this and the swing would simply not be powerful enough to close out the game. Because Karnassa needed to come down early in order to be effective enough to close out the game, it meant that your deck basically needed to be filled with 1-cost minions, so that 7 could be consistently drawn and played by turn 4 or 5. This deck building restriction ended up being too restrictive, with early game often being lost by the hunter player due to many one-cost minions being easily removed or otherwise dealt with, and Queen Carnassa coming down as early as possible, but being unable to close out the game due to how little had been accomplished by only playing one-cost minions up to that point. Both the Caverns Below and Open the Waygate ended up being in contention for being the strongest quest cards ever made, and both dominated the Ungoro meta. Interestingly, coming into the expansion, many content creators at the time predicted the power of Open the Waygate. Taking an extra turn is obviously very strong, and many creators correctly stated that it was a card which would only become more problematic as time went on and more cards were introduced. This ended up being true, with the card remaining popular in Wild well after its rotation, and eventually being nerfed from requiring 6 spells to requiring 8 in Ashes of Outland, a full year after it had been rotated out of the standard format entirely. Even in its nerfed state, it still rears its head occasionally in Wild to this day. Having said that, I think the Caverns Below is simultaneously the most powerful quest card ever released and the worst quest card in the set in terms of fulfilling the quest fantasy. At the time, many content creators slept on the power of the Caverns Below, with many saying that the requirement of playing 4 minions with the same name was unrealistic to fulfill in most games, but with some creators insisting that the card would be insane and the requirement would be easy to fulfill. Unfortunately, the second group turned out to be right. Multiple return-to-hand effects such as Youthful Brewmaster, Shadow Step, Mimic Pod, and Gadget Sand Ferryman, alongside cards like Firefly, which generated a 1-mana token, which was the perfect target to be bounced, ended up meaning that the quest was often completed on turn 4 or 5. The board would then be flooded with 1-mana 5/5s, and the game was basically over in the next 2 or 3 turns. No deck at the time had the tools to deal with that many 5/5s early in the game. This card would go on to be nerfed twice, once at the end of Ungoro, which increased the number of minions required to meet the condition from 4 to 5, and then again in the Witchwood, where the continuous effect was nerfed to make all minions 4/4 instead of 5/5. Even with the first nerf, the card continued to dominate the meta until the Witchwood, which led to the second nerf. Even then, the card would still occasionally see play until it eventually rotated. In the modern game, thankfully the card almost never sees play, and I think that this is probably for the best. Playing against the card was incredibly frustrating at the height of its power, and the deck was one of the most divisive of all time in terms of player reception. Further to all this, the thematic aspect of the card was also easily the weakest of the 9 quests released in Ungoro. Your guess as to what repeatedly playing the same minion has to do with finding a crystal gore which makes all of your minions 5/5 for some reason is as good as mine. Let me know if you have any good thoughts to that in the comments. There is no doubt in my mind that these quests as a whole were incredibly good from a thematic perspective. However, the balance of the cards was somewhat questionable, with some quests being completely useless even at the time of release, and others continuing to be staples in Wild even up to today. The release of Rise of Shadows and the start of the Year of the Dragon saw our original quests rotate to Wild. There was a short time during Rise of Shadows where there were no quests at all in the standard meta for Hearthstone. We were all left wondering, would quest cards make a second appearance? After all, there had been none printed beyond the original run in Journey to Ungoro, which was a full 2 years ago at this point. A few months later, with the release of Saviours of Uldum, our questions were answered. There would be a second round of quests printed in this set, and although their design would be quite similar in terms of the requirements which had to be fulfilled, the design behind the quest rewards would be somewhat different. Seemingly learning from the successful gameplay loop of Fireplume's Heart, all of the new quests would reward a new hero power, instead of a powerful swing card. Ultimately, I think that this decision led to a much lower power level overall for these quests, and a much more consistent power level among the series of quests. Of course, there were some winners and some losers, but with only 1 or 2 notable exceptions, all of the quests saw reasonable play or at least experimentation in some form. It's also worth noting that as a result of the rewards of the quests being of a lower power level overall, the quests were also much easier to complete on the whole than their Ungoro counterparts. This resulted in decks running these quests generally being built around them, but not so much so that the deck felt unplayable if you didn't manage to complete the quest. The deck building pitfalls of cards like the Marsh Queen were seen much less here. Thematically, some of the quests were a bit more questionable for me. Cards like Bizarre Burglary make perfect sense. Steal cards from your opponent and get a reward for it. This matches perfectly with the class fantasy of being a rogue. The other end of the spectrum would be cards like Corrupt Waters, an extremely powerful card, probably the most powerful quest released in this set on balance, but with a very tenuous thematic package. What does playing Battlecry minions have to do with corrupting the waters? And why is playing Battlecry something inherently shamanistic? Outside of the obvious connections with Shudderwock from the Witchwood, playing a Battlecry doesn't really have anything to do with being a shaman, or with corrupting the waters. Why not have a condition to play a certain amount of Overload cards? I don't know. The thematic just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. Let me know in the comments if you have a better understanding of it. In terms of power level, the reverse is true. As I mentioned earlier, Corrupt the Waters ended up being an extremely powerful card. Not as powerful as the Crystal Core, but it saw a lot of play in the expansion in which it was introduced, as well as the follow-up expansion, Descent of Dragons, where it synergized particularly well with Galakrond the Tempest. It then continued to pop up occasionally in Shaman decks for pretty much its entire standard lifetime. Time will tell if it ends up becoming an Open the Waygate-esque wild powerhouse, or if it fades into obscurity after its rotation. I expect the latter, but you can never be sure what Battlecry synergies might be printed for Shaman in the future. Bizarre Burglary, on the other hand, ended up being one of the worst quests in the set, seeing some decent experimentation on release, but ultimately dropping off the radar soon after that. Although the condition for the quest was easy to fulfill, the payoff was simply not powerful enough to justify spending your turn 1 playing the quest, in a card which otherwise has quite a lot of options for turn 1. Hack the System suffered similarly. In a class which can do a lot on turn 1, the payoff of summoning a 3-4 golem later in the game was usually too weak by the time the quest had been completed to justify spending your turn 1 to set it up, and as a result, the card saw very little play. Supreme Archaeology and Untapped Potential were probably the most complete packages in terms of quest cards in this set. The thematics matched reasonably well with the class fantasy, and the reward effects were powerful, but only really shone if you had built your deck specifically around them. These two also continued to pop up occasionally throughout their standard rotation, but never reached the point of being oppressive to play against, as Corrupt the Waters arguably did at some points. Ultimately, I think that the Saviours of Uldum quests were a much more consistent experience overall than those seen in Ungoro, but at the expense of some of the flair that cards like Queen Carnassa and Galvadon had displayed. Compared to Galvadon, making mummies is simply boring. Compared to the swarm feeling of playing a Queen Carnassa deck, unsealing the vault and buffing all your minions by +2 attack just lacked a certain amount of thematic creativity. Overall, I think that this series of quests was a step in the right direction in terms of making the quest deck experience more consistent to play, but I think that in bringing all of these quests a bit closer together in terms of power level, they came to lack some of the thematic elements which made the original series of Ungoro quests so great. Forged in the Barrens has just been announced as Hearthstone's 17th expansion, and in the few cards revealed so far, there are no quests. Perhaps we'll have another small hiatus for quests, where Standard will be without them for a time. Nevertheless, I'm certain that quests will be revisited at some point in the future. My hope is that when Blizzard next comes to design some quest cards, they don't feel the need to include a quest for every class. It seems to me that there is often understandably some struggle in finding a theme from the expansion which can match the gameplay expectations of a quest for every class. It seems like the theme for the Year of the Griffin is Alliance versus Horde, with the teaser image given showing what looks like a Horde expansion, followed by what looks like an Alliance expansion, and finally followed by what looks like a Horde versus Alliance expansion. I would be excited to see quests for some classes on the Horde side, followed up by quests for the rest of the classes on the Alliance side in the following expansion, ensuring that each class has an appropriate theme from the expansion to match the theme of these quest cards. Failing this, it seems like the final expansion of the year would be the perfect place to implement some quests with its Alliance versus Horde themes. Perhaps we could even see 2 neutral quests involving playing cards or mechanics which are exclusive to each faction. I have no idea if any of this will ever happen, but I'm excited to see where Blizzard take the idea of quest cards in the future, and to see how much they've learned about bettering the quest experience over the past 4 years. Thanks for getting this far into the video and watching the history of quests in Hearthstone. Leave a comment if you have any ideas for similar videos to this which I could make in the future, and let me know if you liked it. Thanks!